You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management. Welcome to Natural Resources University. This week's episode features Deer University, hosted by Bronson Strickland and Steve Damaris.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. This is Bronson Strickland, and my colleague Steve Damaris will not be joining us today. He is on the road and unavailable. But I have a guest on the podcast, and that is Dr. Craig Harper from the University of Tennessee. And we are lucky that Craig is going to share his wealth of knowledge and expertise today, specifically focusing on warm season food plots, the do's and don'ts, the good, bad, and the ugly, etc. So, Craig, thank you for your time, generosity to spend with us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Happy to be with you, buddy.
Well, Craig, where I wanted to start is I'm going to tell my story, and maybe you can tell me yours in regards to warm season plots. And just in general, what I've seen over the years and other people is that most people, when they get into land management, and we're focusing on deer here, of course, but most people are completely at ease starting a cool season food plot program for various reasons. It can be just for the purpose of attracting deer, seeing deer, harvesting deer. It can also be going to the next level of really the attempt to improve nutrition, etc. So a lot of people do that and are comfortable doing that. What we don't see nearly as often are people planting warm season plots. And that to me is something I've noticed that there can be a decided shift once they start doing that and seeing a difference in deer quality on a property. How about your experience with that?
It's the same, and I believe what you described largely is because most people plant food plots, cool season food plots to hunt over. And although you can hunt over most warm season food plots during the early portion of the deer season, especially the bow season, of course, there are some warm season plots, principally soybeans and corn, that, of course, you can hunt over if you have hanging beans and obviously corn that is lasting into fall and winter. And they can be excellent food resources to hunt around. But most people, I believe, in talking to folks, concentrate on cool season food plots because they relate that to their ability to hunt over those. And with regard to establishment and cost, the establishment and cost, especially of cool season annuals, is considerably easier than the establishment and cost of corn, for example. And when you're planting soybeans on most sites where people are managing for deer, they have a decent, if not high, deer density. And so they have real issues with regard to even establishing soybeans, for example. And so after trying that a couple of times, they give up. They don't worry about it. This is not working for me, that kind of thing. And they go back to wheat, oats, annual clovers, brassicas, what have you.
I know that was my personal experience the very first time I tried a warm season plot. And of course, I was really naive at the time, but I was overwhelmed with the cost was significant. It was different. I was not ready to handle the weed pressure. And so I did not have any knowledge of how to the appropriate herbicides to use that time of year. So, and one thing we have to mention here as well is that at least something in the South that's been shown time and time again is that even though it's the time of year where there is the appearance of all these green plants, is that diet can really be limited for deer in terms of quality in the late summer and early fall. And so that's something I think when we start seeing shifts and increases in body weight, fat content, et cetera, and a little bump in antler size, et cetera, when they're adding the warm season plots, is you're really adding good food at a time of year where a low hole in the bucket when deer really need it.
Right. And if I can interrupt for a second, and to feel that without planting a food plot, you're having to implement, or you are best off if you implement disturbance through the growing season such that you have continued stimulation of fresh growing young plants. And of course, we do that most often by burning at different times from June, July, August, September, even into October for different reasons. But in general, if you have burned or disturbed an area during the dormant season or early portion of the growing season and you get regrowth by late summer, the nutritional content, the digestibility of those plants tend to go down as the plants mature. And of course, there are some differences in many of the forbs that continue to produce new leaves through the summer until they mature, flower, and die, or frost gets them. But by and large, these plants are maturing. They're getting bigger, older. Their cell walls are getting larger. The lignin content is increasing. The digestibility goes down. And so the nutrition that deer get from these plants and the attractiveness of these plants to deer during or by late summer is really declining. And so warm season food plots fill that gap. You know, we talk about this nutritional bottleneck, but the nutritional requirements with regard to crude protein, phosphorus, calcium, things that we generally consider are going down a little bit by that time of year. But the energy requirement, of course, still is there. And that energy, as well as digestible carbohydrates and fat, are important with regard to them beginning to build some fat reserves through late summer going into fall.
So, Craig, in general, what we think of is midsummer, late summer is a nutritional bottleneck, and especially for does. And we all know what's going on with them. They are either in mid to late gestation or they're beginning lactation. And that is one of the most nutritionally demanding times of the year. And that's something that can be addressed with warm season plots or habitat management.
Yeah, certainly. And that is especially true, I would say, from spring through midsummer for most locations with regard to the does. Of course, once you get into the deep south where the rut is later and timing of birth is later, that period, of course, persists on in later into summer. But, you know, this, quote, nutritional bottleneck in late summer, early fall is often mentioned, but we have to consider, number one, when are antlers growing and when are does lactating? When is the milk production period greatest? When are they having to produce the most milk, the highest energy demand of the does for the fawns? And so I think this is critically important to consider if you're thinking about planting warm season forages, when you're conducting other habitat management practices, and also fitting in cool season forages, both annual and especially perennial. So, of course, bucks begin growing antlers. They're budding out and beginning to grow new antlers in April. Typically by mid-April, you're seeing new antlers begin to grow. fawns, at least through, let's be real general here, most of the country are being born in May and June. And of course, many in July, especially in those areas where the rut is later. And so that milk production period is really critical, obviously, May, June, and into July and into August even for some of those areas. So think about when the most highly nutritional foods are available during the biological period that deer really need them. And for bucks, that's going to be from April through the end of June. By early July, roughly 75% of the antler development is complete. And by early August, roughly 90% is complete. And so the main antler growing months are April, May, and June. And so having really high quality foods, and a lot of it at that time, is very important for bucks. And so when are you planting warm season forages? And in most areas of the country, that's going to be mid-May through early June. Now, further down south, that could be late April and early May. So meshing these time periods together is important. And so I mention that because for much of the country, this critical nutritional period for bucks growing antlers, you really can meet that quite well with perennial cool season forages and with some annuals that continue to produce through April and on through May. Now, the importance of some of the warm plantings is that, okay, perhaps the crude protein content, phosphorus, calcium content of the forages is beginning to wane. The need for those minerals, high amounts of those minerals are beginning to wane as you get into late summer because the antler growing period is done. But the energy need is still there. And that's where these warm season food plots can really shine in providing highly digestible energy, digestible carbohydrates, and receiving considerable fat content during that time that will help them begin to build some fat reserves in late summer going into fall, which obviously is very important, especially when you run into one of those years and you're relying on acorns, if you're worried about that. In low acorn years that you don't see fluctuations in body weights. And when the habitat on a particular property is managed correctly, you should not see declines in body weights or even fat when you don't have good acorn years. That's when you're rocking with your habitat management. You got 1 to 2 inch fat layers on the back of deer, and there's hardly any acorns in the woods.
So thank you for that. I think clearly now have made the case for how important warm season plantings can be and habitat management, maximizing nutrition during summer is. And I think you also addressed a critical point too, Craig, that we always say during that late spring, early summer, that is the very reason why we recommend not using the same ground typically for your cool season and your warm season, is that you want the cool season to roll into late spring, early summer.
That's right. And that's particularly true if you're using conventional tillage. Now, of course, there are no-till practices, either no-till topsowing or no-till drilling, of course, that you can implement to move that seamlessly on the same ground. But the big point that I want to try and make here is that warm season food plots are not a cure-all. Cool season food plots are not a cure-all. But when you combine those in the proper and you have them producing at the time that is complementing, and this is what's so important, complementing your habitat management, your forest management, your field management, that is encouraging naturally available forage. I mean, that should be first and foremost. And you are meshing these three together. Your natural forages, both in the woods and in the fields, as well as cool season food plots and warm season food plots. That's when you are maximizing forage availability as well as forage quality throughout the year. And you're paying special attention to those periods of the year when growth really requires the highest quality nutrition.
Amen. Well, Craig, let's move into now kind of more operationally. Hopefully we've sold everyone. They understand how critical it is. What should people plant? And I guess I would like to kind of briefly discuss, best case scenario, here are the best forages. But for a lot of people, whether it be expense, acreage, deer density, etc., a great example would be, I would love to have a 20-acre field and plant it in soybeans, but I lease my property and I only have a few designated areas. So why don't we start with best case scenario and then move to maybe some smaller plots, high deer density scenarios?
In my opinion, the best case scenario is soybeans, period. It has, I don't think I do not believe there is a green plant that deer would rather eat rather than soybeans, above soybeans. Soybeans have outstanding attraction to deer, outstanding nutrition. And then the reason I place soybeans first is because you have the added benefit of the standing beans in fall and going into winter, as opposed to just the green growing forage that is providing nutrition through the summer. So you get both out of soybeans. That's why I give them the number one nod. Obviously, the restriction with soybeans is that you have to have relatively large acreage to plant. Now, what does relatively mean? Relatively is according to how many deer you have and how much highly attractive natural forage you have. So if you have a lot of highly attractive natural forage, then you can get by with planting some smaller soybean fields. What is smaller? I don't know. That's according to how many deer are on your property. You see what I'm saying? So you just can't, you can plant 3 acres and you'll be fine. There's many cases where 10 acres is not enough. I've obviously seen that, but by and large, you're going to have to plant larger fields if you're going to have good success, especially with soybeans, to a little lesser extent with cowpeas and lab, for example. Cowpeas and lab are vining legumes that are not selected as strongly soon after they germinate and they're relatively small, like cowpeas are, and that's where like soybeans are, and that's where soybeans, it's difficult to get them established because they're nipped off as soon as they germinate, and then you have poor seedling survival. So by and large, and I know this has to be very general and average, but if you can plant 3+ acres, then certainly give soybeans a try. But think of these plots as relatively large fields that are, quote, feeding grounds. You are simply trying to pump as much nutrition, energy into the deer as possible on these during summer, going into late summer and early fall. When you're relegated to planting smaller fields, you can go to some other forages, especially something like American joint vetch and Alice clover. Neither of those might be quite as selected by deer as soybeans, especially not Alice clover, but they withstand grazing much better. And they provide excellent nutrition for deer. Deer readily eat them, and you can buy with smaller plots with those forages as compared to soybeans or even cowpeas. Now, to go into those areas where, I only have an acre to plant, you don't have any more than that. In situations, more often than not, in my opinion, you are better off not trying to plant a warm season food plot, but instead trying to manage the early successional plants that are going to arise naturally in that plot. Or, worst case scenario, you might be able to plant some naturally occurring plants. A good example would be planting common ragweed and partridge pea. 4 or 5 pounds of ragweed and about a pound or two of partridge pea. In doing so, I like to work up a good seed bed, similar if you're going to plant clovers conventionally, and sow those seed in wintertime so they get a few freezes and falls on them, so to help break seed dormancy and just manage those small fields for early successional growth. You're really going to be better off doing that than trying to put those really small fields in warm season forages, and they're only going to be overgrazed anyway.
Great. That's a great recommendation. Craig, what is often done down here is exactly what you addressed is smaller plots. A real effective mix can be Alice clover and deer vetch. We see that very commonly. Where does cowpeas and lab fall into in terms of deer selection palatability? Soybean is clearly best, but do you call them a runner-up?
Yes. And I've seen, and we've measured on some properties where cowpeas might be selected a little over lab, and on some properties where lab was selected a little over cowpeas. So by and large, I put them in a similar selection category, if you will. I would say they both are a little more strongly selected than Alice clover, but I would say American joint vetch is selected at least as much as cowpeas and lab, if not a little better. And before we go any further, I know someone, and this would be a great question, someone may have the question listening, thinking, well, if I would just manage these small fields for early succession, why do I even need to plant the big fields in soybeans or cowpeas or lab or what have you? And you don't. If you have, and you're able to manage correctly for your early succession, you certainly can meet the need, the nutritional requirement of deer by doing so. The advantage, if you will, of planting is that if you are planting suitable acreage that the plants are able to grow, establish, and produce what they should, you're going to get more tonnage per acre out of a soybean, cowpea, lab, joint vetch food plot than you would from most early successional plant communities. In terms of the early succession and considering only those plants that deer eat and the portions of the plants that deer eat, you're typically looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 2,000 pounds per acre. Now, certainly we have seen the case where that may be 3,000 or 4,000 pounds per acre. Now, keep in mind that's only weighing, measuring the portions of the plants that deer eat, not whole field, whole plant biomass. Whereas with the warm season food plots, you're typically getting somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 pounds per acre. And with some plantings, such as soybeans and cowpeas, that might be bumped up to 6,000 pounds per acre. And if you're, sampling whole plants and weighing that, that's when, you might get 10,000 pounds per acre. But in most instances, deer are not eating those large stems that you would see out there, come late July or August, that's at the base of a soybean or a cowpea plant. Although hungry deer will eat those, especially, for example, if you have fenced deer out of the food plot and the food plot is able to grow and produce maximum amount, and then you take down the fence and there's a whole herd of deer that's moving in there to all of a sudden get a nutritious food source.
Well, Craig, getting back to the deer vetch is I really like that forage because it is so much more browse resistant than something like soybeans. So it's been really successful for a lot of people with smaller acreage and a lot of deer. The knock has always been is that it's really slow to establish and grow. And so rather than having a really viable food plot, say in June, you might be several weeks later on into July before you have a really productive food plot.
That's absolutely true.
I like your strategy, if you wouldn't mind sharing with us, of a companion plant that's going to jump out of the ground real quick to buffer the joint vetch.
Well, the best thing to include if you want something jumping out of the ground fast probably would be buckwheat. But if you use buckwheat, then your weed control in a joint vetch plot is limited to only controlling grasses. And so what we like to do if we're planting joint vetch alone, and let me clarify, joint vetch and deer vetch and Aeschynomene, that's the same plant. Aeschynomene is the genus, and deer vetch or American joint vetch, those are just common names. When we are planting joint vetch separately or with Alice clover, then we can use an herbicide such as Pursuit that contains imazethapyr at 2 to 4 ounces per acre and really produce, that's applied pre-emergence. And so that really helps produce a clean plot that is relatively weed free. And then if we later in summer begin to have some grass weed problems germinate and come in, we can go over that with an application of clethodim or some other grass selective herbicide and control those grasses. But if you use buckwheat, you can't use any broadleaf selective herbicide because it'll kill the buckwheat.
10-4. While we're on the topic, I'm kind of fast forwarding here. I want to move next into from your book. You list a lot of mixes, but before we get to some of those warm season mixes that you have found to be really effective, let's stay on deer vetch with how effective you can be even without conventional tillage. In other words, no tilling and top sowing deer vetch can give you a pretty good warm season plot.
Yes, we commonly no-till top sow American joint vetch, and it does very good at that. The seed are relatively small, much about the size, a little different shape, but much the size of a crimson or Berseem clover, not quite as small as Ladino, but it's a small seed. And so you can top sow that into existing vegetation. You need to use a little higher seeding rate, at least 25% additional seed. So a single species planting of joint vetch would be about 20 pounds per acre. And so you'd use, maybe at least 25 pounds per acre, and that's pure live seed, and sow that into existing vegetation at the proper time. And then use, something as simple as glyphosate, a broad spectrum herbicide, to kill all of the existing plant growth. And then as those plants die and begin to decompose and you get a few rains on it, the germination is not as fast, but it will come and the joint vetch will come right out from underneath that. So it works very, very well. If you do not have existing vegetation, then you won't have the moisture there that will help with regard to germination and survival of the seedlings. So if it's like bare ground and crusted over, that's not going to work well. You then need to scarify that soil and then get good seed to soil contact where that rootlet can get in and get established. Once it germinates, you will run into frustration if you're trying to no-till topsoil on hard crusted over soil. But if you are in existing vegetation and you kill that vegetation appropriately as it dies and begins to decompose, and whether this is joint vetch or various clovers or even brassicas, that works very well for establishing the plot without having to break the ground.
Well, let's move into mixes now, Craig. In your book, you have several mixes that over your years of experience have shown to be really effective. And I know one thing I've heard you talk about many, many times is whether you're buying a commercial mix or doing it yourself, is people often neglect your herbicide options based on what you're mixing together. So you've got a non-legume broadleaf or a grass, et cetera, all mixed together. And so it basically takes away any options you have to control weeds. So if you don't mind going into maybe one or two or three, if you got them, mixes that you've seen across the range of the Southeast and East that have been really good for you.
Well, the big issue, as you just identified, is that you can use various herbicides with various crop plants and not with others. And so according to what your primary weed or weeds are, and on some plots you don't have that big of a problem, but on other plots you have a tremendous problem. And most of the time it's somewhere in between. So considering what your weed pressure is going to be in that field, you need to match your planting with what will be an herbicide application that you can use without harming that planting and controlling that problem weed or weeds. So if you use, the kitchen sink mix where it's got a little bit of everything in there, then that means you have no herbicide option. There's no herbicide that you can apply to control weeds that won't kill at least one species that is in the mixture. Now, that may or may not be a big deal if you don't mind losing one or more of the plants in the mixture, but just a little bit of planning can help prevent that. So, a very simple one, and one that happens all the time, some of our worst warm season weeds, of course, are grasses, whether it's crabgrass, Dallas grass, sandbur, Johnson grass, foxtails, witchgrass, fall panic. I mean, just go on and on and on. And so if you include a grass in your warm season mixture that also contains leguminous forbs or non-leguminous forbs, then you can't control the grass without killing the grass that you included in the mixture. The obvious one that most people try to use is grain sorghum, sometimes sorghum Sudan. If you don't have a grass problem, that may be just fine. And there's nothing, quote, wrong with including grain sorghum or a Sudan as a structure plant, but deer are not eating those while they're green or growing. And if they are, you've just identified a real problem. And so instead, we would include a forb, the one we typically use is sunflowers, of course, at a reduced rate to allow the vining legumes. And so the cowpeas and lablab, for example, are vines. And so if you plant a straight plant in your mixture that those vines can climb up on and grow, then you get more tonnage out of that food plot per acre than you would if you did not include the substrate plant and the vines were just, growing the ground and overlapping each other. You won't get as much tonnage that way. And so that's why we include what we call a structured plant. And so if we're planting sunflowers with cowpeas or lablab, we're only including 5 pounds of sunflowers. We're not looking for a sunflower field. We're just looking for, scattered sunflower plants that the vines can, vine up on and produce more forage. That is not necessary if you're planting soybeans, because soybeans is not a vine. And even if you're planting an indeterminate group 7 soybean, that's still going to remain standing without, quote, vining up something. So we do not include substrate plants in our soybean plots. When we're planting soybeans, we plant soybeans by themselves. We don't mix them with any substrate plant. We don't mix them with corn. We don't mix them with grain sorghum or sunflowers or anything else. It's just sunflowers or just soybeans. But if we're planting cowpeas or lablab, we always plant a substrate plant.
would you ever, Craig, in this case, I'm sorry, I'm kind of rewinding here on a soybean question, a scenario where you just can't control the deer density any more than you can. In other words, you're on an acreage where you're trying to control does and deer in general as much as possible, but you're just overwhelmed by neighbors, for example. Are you ever, with an attempt on a soybean plot, are you ever going to increase seed density, seeding rate in that case? Would you ever say double the amount of soybean seed that you would plant, acknowledging that you're never going to get to the end and have a stand that's going to produce grain? Deer are just going to overwhelm them. But at least for, say, 2 to 3 months, you might create more biomass during the middle of the summer.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll even take that a step further. We commonly plant, for example, 1.5 to 2 bags of soybeans per acre. And of course, soybeans are bagged such that 1 bag of beans should cover 1 acre. And so it's based on seed count. And the seed company, according to what variety they have in the bag, they will adjust that seed count in the bag such that it is appropriate. Now, they are bagging these seed for soybean production. They are not bagging these seed for deer food plots when you have too many deer than what you should have ideally to grow soybeans. You see what I'm saying? So it's common that we will plant 1.5 to 2 bags of soybeans per acre. I've even planted 3 bags of soybeans per acre at that rate. And what that does is that, obviously doubles or so the amount of seedlings, soybean seedlings that you have as they're establishing. And then that gives the deer twice the number of soybean plants. And as some of them are nipped off and not going to grow any further, others are at least able to get the point that they can grow and continue to persist in that grazing pressure. With that, even if you are able to maintain the soybean height, let's say 10 to 12 inches, those soybean plants that are only 10 to 12 inches still will flower when they are supposed to, according to photo period. And soybeans are bred such that they flower according to the amount of daylight. And so according to which maturity group of soybeans you're planting, they're going to flower and try to produce a seed pod when that daylight length is at a certain point. And so at some point during the summer to late summer, they're going to flower and produce seed. So it's very common that you might have, 12-inch tall soybean plants out there with seed pods all over. Now, those seed pods are not going to last as long as if those plants were 3 feet tall because there's just not as many of them, but they're still out there and deer will eat them. Know that we are going to be in that situation with soybeans largely getting grazed over. That means there's going to be considerable space in between the soybean plants. And so the sunlight is going to hit the ground between the soybean plants. The soybean plants are not going to what we call canopy over and shade out any competition that's beneath the soybeans. In those situations, Mark Turner and some other graduate students of mine, we've experimented with adding joint vetch in with the soybeans, and we've also done this with cowpeas, and it works great. The joint vetch does not germinate and establish as quickly as the soybeans or cowpeas. That's fine because they are never shading the joint vetch out because they're not, canopying over because of the deer grazing pressure. Also, once the joint vetch germinates and begins to grow pretty well, then the deer are eating the joint vetch as well as the soybeans or cowpeas, and that's relieving some grazing pressure on the soybeans and cowpeas. So that works together, and you can have a great mixture of soybeans and joint vetch or cowpeas and joint vetch. Now, early on, when we were in some of our first trials, and this is like, 24 years ago, we tried this, but if your soybeans are allowed to grow and develop as they should without heavy grazing pressure, then the joint vetch is not going to fare well, because the joint vetch will be shaded out by the cowpeas or the soybeans. But if you have considerable grazing pressure, that's keeping those plants from canopying over and shading out what's underneath, and it works very well.
Okay, Craig, you've mentioned, like, for example, pursuit. Are there any other herbicides, I guess the toolbox of the most commonly used herbicides for warm season plantings? What do you see most often?
Well, of course, with soybeans, most of the soybeans are glyphosate resistant, and of course, glyphosate resistant weeds, whether that's several of the species of pigweeds or horseweed or what have you. There's several plants that have become glyphosate resistant and problematic. Then you would go with a different soybean variety, whether that be, soybeans that are tolerant of glufosinate or, Liberty link beans, or whether you go with soybeans that are tolerant of dicamba. There's different approaches, but there's also other pre-emergence and pre-plant incorporated herbicides that can be used. And there are many of them, from, old common ones like Dual 2 Magnum and Prowl to several others that have been developed more recently. And also, don't forget that there are some post-emergence herbicides that certainly can be used over the top of soybeans to help with problem weeds as well. And, there's a bunch of them. I mean, I could just mention a bunch of them, but they're all listed in the appendix in the food plot book if anybody is interested in checking out all of the different herbicide options and applications that they might be able to use. With regard to the soybeans, Lab, they largely are tolerant of the same herbicides, those two plants. And for the most part, you can lump that in with many of the herbicides that are used for soybeans as well. But of course, according to law, you were supposed to only use the herbicides that are labeled for that crop. And so be careful and look and see which herbicides are labeled for those crops, and obviously, certainly use herbicides according to the label.
Gotcha. Okay, Craig, why don't we wrap up with some research that you and your team, I know Mark Turner was a big part of that. He presented it recently. So now we're talking about a perennial plot, but it's management during the summertime. And I'm specifically using a white clover, perennial clover, but I think you also had included alfalfa maybe in some of that mix or those mixes as well. So commonly, if you have an established white clover plot, most people are going to want to mow it during the summertime. And the idea is that you are going to stimulate more growth. You're going to improve the quality of it, make it more palatable. It is also a tool to reduce weed pressure. That's the thinking anyway. And you kind of took that to task and set up an experiment where you monitored the quality of the food plot. You monitored weed pressure with mowing treatments and non-mowing treatments, and you even measured deer visitation. And I know we could talk for an hour on this, but if you don't mind, why don't we hit the highlights of that?
Yeah, we could talk for an hour, because when you start talking about mowing and perennial food plots, to some people, you might as well be talking about their mama. You know what I'm saying? Or it's like their religion, like, oh my gosh, I just gave you some information that you didn't have to go out there and sit on a tractor and waste diesel fuel. You should be saying, thank you. Great. This is wonderful, as opposed to absolutely not. I must go out and do food plots every 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know why this invokes such a strong response from some people, but hey, whatever. Let me back up for a second. The reason we ever looked at this in the first place is because, at least for me, time is precious. I don't want to go mow my food plots or mow anything or spray anything or whatever if I don't have to. So I guess this began many years ago when we were beginning to look at the nutritional quality of a lot of naturally occurring plants. And we were finding that the quality of so many of these plants is outstanding, and that deer were eating them about as regularly, selecting them, as they do many of the food plot portions. And so in our perennial plot management, of course, we're noticing many of these, quote, weeds are being eaten about as readily as the food plot forages. And we started to think, should we mow this or not? Because, the deer are eating it. And so then that led ultimately to a series of experiments where we were looking at deer visitation, forage quality, because as you mentioned, you can look at I don't look at blogs and all that kind of thing, but some people will send me something and say, oh, look at what so-and-so said, or, what have you. But people adamantly believe, many people, that if you mow a food plot, that makes it more attractive and more nutritious. And so that's hard to answer unless you, of course, collect the data. And so we've collected the data on mowed and unmowed food plots for many years. And what causes a lot of confusion is the data that are in the agricultural journals are indeed accurate, showing that the forages after mowing more digestible and more nutritious than the forages that have not been mowed. But the devil's in the details. In those studies, they are clipping whole plant samples because they're doing so. Look at the effect of mowing largely in pastures or in hay for livestock. And so also that means they largely are analyzing data from grasses, from forbs, such as clovers. So two things are going on. Number one, deer don't eat grass, especially during the summertime, unless they literally are about to starve. Also, you look at the growing point of grasses and you watch grass as it grows through the summer. The oldest part of the plant is at the tip. With forbs, it's just the opposite. Forbs are putting out new plants at the tips and growing points at the end of the limbs or tops of the plants. And so there's new leaves being produced on most of these forbs throughout the growing season. And deer, of course, are concentrate selectors. They are not roughage feeders or true grazers like cattle are. And so they are concentrating their feeding on select plants and select plant parts. And if you look at, easily look at any plants that deer have been eating, they're always nipping off the plants at the top or on the outside because they're the youngest and most nutritious. And so when you sample the plants, sample the leaves on the plants that the deer typically would be eating, you find that the nutritional quality of those that have not been mowed is the same as the leaves of plants that have been mowed, and then they begin to grow back. And obviously, your biomass of plant material that deer can eat in unmowed plots is greater than that in mowed plots because, you just clipped off, half to quarters of the forage that was out there. And so then you begin to think about the structure. Okay, and there's some weeds coming into the plot. You're starting to have a taller structure. And the structure is related to the density and height of vegetation. And so you can, think about the structure important to deer visitation. And so we began putting out cameras in mowed and unmowed plots. And sure enough, we found that the visitation in unmowed plots was twice as great as that in mowed plots. And in the experiment that you're referring to, we went back and mowed every month. And we've done others where we mowed every 3 weeks or what have you. And so, I've got nothing per se against somebody that likes to mow. I'm just saying it's not providing you the benefit that you think it's providing based on what that blog or hunting magazine article told you, because it's just not true. That's it. And many of those quote weeds that the deer also are eating. And I have never said that you should never mow a perennial food plot. We mow all of ours every year, but we only mow them once a year, typically in August, maybe early September, because by that time, all of the forages, the perennial forages, have flowered, they've produced seed. You know, it's during a time of year that those forages are going into a dormancy period. The plots are looking kind of ragged. We go ahead and clean all that up with a mowing over the whole plot and get everything ready for fresh fall growth when you get that new bump of growth in the fall. You know, according to your latitude, that's not going to be true if you're in Minnesota, but certainly true if you're in the mid latitudes and further south. So we'll do top dressing at that time in August, September, and we'll always apply another herbicide application in fall or late summer, early fall, as well as in spring. Our spring application is to tend to incoming warm season weeds. Our late summer, early fall application is to tend to incoming cool season weeds. And of course, some of those weeds are going to escape and become prevalent in the plot. There's no herbicide application that's going to kill every single thing and you know, have what most people would consider a quote perfect plot. But it certainly quote controls, helps reduce weed pressure such that you don't have to continue to mow to battle the weeds. Now, let me say this. If you are not using herbicide applications in your perennial plots, and if you choose not to, that is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you do not use herbicide applications at that time, then yes, you are going to have to mow relatively frequently just to keep the weed pressure down, or it's going to overtake your planted forages much more quickly than if you use the herbicide application. So again, this all has to be taken into context. If you're using the appropriate herbicide applications in spring and fall, absolutely, most likely, and in most cases, you're only going to need to mow once per year. If you're not doing that, then you likely will need to mow, probably a few times through the summer just to control the weed competition and prevent it from overtaking your planted forages. And we do this whether we're talking about pure stands of ladino clover or chicory or alfalfa or mixtures. And so we commonly plant perennial mixtures containing alfalfa, red clover, chicory, and ladino clover. That's an outstanding mixture. It does extremely well. And again, we'll spray that once in spring, once in early fall, and mow it once in August. And they're trucking easily for 5 or 6 years.
And you even measured, to prove the point, you measured biomass. And so when you're not mowing, you have a greater amount of biomass. That should be very obvious to most people. You also measured nutrient concentration or plant quality. There was no difference at all in plant quality, mowed, unmowed. But then also you measured deer visitation.
Right.
And so was there no difference, or was there greater deer visitation in the unmowed?
No, like I just mentioned, we had twice the visitation in the unmowed plots as compared to the mowed plots. And these are not like separate food plots by hundreds of yards. This is, like a large food plot complex where we have blocks, multiple blocks that might be anywhere from, a quarter of an acre or a half acre, whatever, that are mowed, and then other blocks that are not mowed, and cameras placed in each of those blocks throughout the field such that it looks kind of like a checkerboard.
Right. Well, thank you for clarifying that, Craig. And that is very interesting, very applicable good research. And I really like how you wrapped it up with essentially it depends. But there's always context.
There's
you
always
have to
context,
include.
no doubt. Yeah.
So thank you for clarifying that. Well, buddy, I really appreciate your time. I think we've gone close to an hour, if not beyond an hour. I know you're a very busy man. Just appreciate you carving out some time and being with us.
Hey, no problem. My pleasure. And of course, it's always good to be with you.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.